Hello there, John Cuturillo here, the life coach of your listener. Thank you for joining me for this episode. Today I'd like to have a more detailed discussion about differentiating between normal human experience and mental illness and what constitutes specifically psychopathology. Now, as per normal, before I begin, never take what you see on the internet as advice. If you have concerns about your own welfare, be it your mental health or otherwise, please seek professional advice. And also, please don't take anything that we discuss today as an attack on any one viewpoint. I'm here to analyze information objectively. I'm here to present perspectives and to open discussion, because ultimately that's what we need in order to learn about life. Now, in the present time, with the expanded and more frequent talk about mental illness and validating the experiences of those who live with mental illnesses and the struggles that they face as a result of them, there has been seen something of an extreme reaction to that, of people claiming that we pathologize everything. In other words, that every possible human experience is now being medicalized to the point that every person or any person can potentially have a mental illness just for experiencing something that they believe is relatively normal. So, for example, people claim, well, depression isn't a real illness because everybody gets sad, or anxiety isn't a real illness, everybody gets anxious. And a related argument to this is that, well, in the old days it wasn't like that. In my day we didn't see so many mentally ill people. Why is everybody suddenly mentally ill? This must be some kind of lie designed to excuse people's bad behavior. Okay, I'm going to be addressing each of these arguments in detail today and explaining why they're flawed. Now, what concerns me about these arguments is that if too many people were to adopt them hypothetically, it could lead to widespread belief that mental illness is just a hoax, and that could lead to a lot of people who are mentally ill and need support for their daily living, having their supports withdrawn. Now, I seriously doubt that that will happen on any large scale, because overall it seems we are progressing in our discussion of mental illness, and we are becoming more accepting and more understanding of why people need assistance if they do have a mental illness. But it's still best practice for us to address flawed arguments, because the best way to counteract flawed arguments is with logical discussion, not through censorship, not through attacking the people who espouse them, just logical discussion of the facts. Now, the first topic to address is, how do we know that an experience that someone's having, such as a feeling or a thought, is really a mental illness and not just a normal part of the human experience? A number of elements have to be present in a person's experience in order for them to be considered mentally ill, okay? The first and perhaps the easiest to identify is that they must have thoughts, feelings, or behaviors, that is to say, they must act in ways that are considered to be abnormal in their social context. In this case, abnormal can have a number of meanings. It can mean maladaptive, that is to say, that thought, feeling, or behavior has a detrimental effect on the individual or others that makes it difficult for them to function in their environment, makes survival less likely, or potentially interrupts the welfare of other people. The other meaning could potentially be that it's simply eccentric or unusual in that context, and that's perhaps the more difficult form of abnormality to identify, because plenty of eccentricity exists that is not mental illness, and we have to be very careful not to miscategorize an eccentric person as a mentally ill person. That would lead to bad consequences, but those are essentially what we mean when we say abnormal. That experience must interfere with the person's functioning, so often these elements can interact with each other, but perhaps the most common form of interference with functioning is interference with executive functioning. And as I've discussed in previous episodes, executive functioning is the ability of the brain to retrieve information from short-term memory, extract it from the environment, process it, and then organize it in a way so as to facilitate the person's decision-making and action. Most people don't think about executive functioning because most of the time we do it without even being aware of it. It's that ingrained, it's that much a part of being human. But what's often not discussed, as I've argued many times before, is one of the most common reasons that mental illness is a problem for the individual experience is that it impedes executive functioning, which means it's not just a case of someone feeling bad or having bad thoughts, it's actually having a real effect on the brain's ability to allow that person to think and act. So that's one of the most common ways that it interferes with functioning. Another way could be by imposing difficulties understanding the demands of the environment, the skills that are necessary in a particular instance, for example, communication skills with other people. This would be more common in, say, cases of intellectual disability or impaired cognition in which the individual has trouble processing information that they get from the environment and being able to learn new information. And often these two elements can interact with each other to form the dysfunction. It must be persistent. So one instance of an abnormal thought or feeling, if it doesn't cause any dangerous behaviour on that person's part, is not necessarily a mental illness. But if it's happening consistently, then it could indicate pathology. Often another element that has to be present is that it can't be explained by conscious choice. So when an individual, for example, commits a particular crime, even though that's abnormal and they can may even be able to justify it, it doesn't necessarily mean they're mentally ill. There may be an association in the environment with mental illness and crime, but that's beside the point. If an individual engages in a particular behaviour, if they have full control of that and they fully understand the implications of their actions, then it's less likely to be the result of mental illness. But this is somewhat of an ambiguous point. It's just another element that may be present. But something that's also important to understand is that mental illness, as we've discovered, it doesn't occur at random. We don't simply observe random phenomena in human experience and decide to just invent new mental illnesses based on a few observations. How classification systems work is when we observe a specific phenomenon, we examine it to see whether it occurs with regularity, that is to say, if the features of it tend to occur together. So when we observe the symptoms that we suspect are a mental illness, we don't simply give it a random name. Okay, what actually happens is, in order for it to become an official diagnosis, it has to be observed a number of times, and it has to be observed with the specific characteristics, that is to say, the symptoms or the signs, together. And often what helps is when it occurs with common antecedents, that is to say, events happening beforehand, like neurochemical activity in the brain, or the person's social situation, or stresses in the person's life, or a personal history that may have contributed. When those characteristics occur together enough times and we see that it's happening with consistency and regularity and having similar effects, then we can say that it's not just a random event, but it's actually a consistent phenomenon. It actually exists as a real event. And then the reason we categorize it is only so that we can collect knowledge about it, because if we don't categorize something and have a consistent way of talking about it, then it's hard for us to study it because we don't know what to look for. And it also is hard for us to start proposing solutions to it, because if we don't recognize consistently what the problem is, then we don't know what exactly it is we're targeting. So when we devise a diagnosis, we're doing so that every time somebody has that same problem, we can collect information about how they've experienced it, we can strengthen our own knowledge of that problem, and then we can propose what might help that person, and then observe the results, and then predict whether that is likely to help other people with a similar problem. That is the basic, ultimate purpose of categorizing mental illnesses and diagnosing them, and how it actually happens. So, in this way, many experiences that are otherwise normal can become pathological when they take on these characteristics and when they become a burden on functioning in a person's life. So, for example, everybody experiences sadness at some stage, but when it becomes so intensive that it's persistent and it prevents a person's brain from functioning normally and them achieving the goals that they want in life, then it may be depression. But for us to propose that depression or anxiety or similar experiences that can be otherwise normal are mental illnesses, it's not to say that they're mental illnesses in every instance of them. We're saying that they can be illnesses. We're not simply proposing that every person who experiences these phenomena gets diagnosed with a mental illness. Now, I'm going to speak to this in just a minute, but one of the reasons I suspect that people might be denying the existence of mental illness and trying to invalidate that certain experiences do constitute illnesses, that they might be concerned that we as a society are trying to medicalise everything as a means of avoiding personal responsibility. That is to say, people trying to claim that they have illnesses so that they don't have to take accountability for their actions. Now, I agree that this in theory is a problem, that people shouldn't use mental illness as an excuse when they know better. That said, I have not seen any evidence, and I would welcome people show me evidence if it exists, but I have not seen any evidence to suggest that most people who actually have a mental illness would use it as an excuse to behave in a way that is threatening to other people. I've met plenty of individuals with mental illness. I have mental illness myself, and trust me, they would want to be able to live their life normally. They don't want... Anytime someone gets an accommodation for mental illness, it's not because they want it, it's because they need it. Okay, sure, mental health care could be better, and it could be better at teaching people how to independently manage their illness, and I agree. That's something that I believe should improve in the mental health care industry, and I'm trying to be the best practitioner that I can be as a life coach, so that when people have struggles in their life, I can help them to independently analyse and resolve those problems. I'm trying to contribute to that, and I agree that mental health care could be better, but that problem is a result of a number of factors. We shouldn't be blaming people who are mentally ill for that problem, because in the end, we're just trying to do the best that we can. Another concern is that the over-medicalisation of the human condition, that is to say, treating everything as an illness, may be something of an overreaction to past trends in which people with mental illness were invalidated. They were treated as if they couldn't make their own choices, they were oppressed, they were institutionalised, they were treated as if their experiences didn't matter and told to just get on with it. There may be a trend potentially in which we're now being too quick to diagnose a mental illness so as not to risk invalidating people. Now, I'll agree that if that is really happening, again, I don't have evidence to suggest that that's the case. I mean, I've seen instances of it happening, but I'm not sure whether there's evidence to suggest that that happens on a mass scale. But if that's happening, I can understand that it happens with the best of intentions. We don't want to repeat past oppression of people with mental illnesses. I agree with that. But the problem with a lot of these discussions in which people say, this isn't a mental illness, that's not a mental illness, this is just over-medicalisation, it's a conspiracy, whatever they may say, the idea is a particularly dangerous one, because I don't see this level of detail in analysing what is a mental illness and what isn't a mental illness. We tend to make overgeneralizations because we just either want an emotional reaction from people or we want to just appease our own emotions. But that's not going to help people solve problems. So yes, there are problems in the way that mental health care operates. Yes, sometimes we may overuse pathology labels, but making overgeneralizations and denying people's experiences is not the way to address that problem. What also doesn't help are people who use mental illness-related terminology in an imprecise fashion. Something that needs to be made clear is the reason we have language is so that when we refer to a specific phenomenon or a concept, the person receiving that communication knows precisely what it is to which we're referring. If we overuse language, it loses its precision and then it loses its communicative value. It loses its utility. An example is when someone's offended, they might say they're triggered. Okay, being triggered means that symptoms of a mental illness are arising to the extent that it's interfering with your functioning. It often happens in trauma-related illnesses like a complex post-traumatic stress disorder and borderline personality disorder. I know how that feels because I get triggers. They don't happen as often anymore, but I've had periods in my past where I have experienced significant triggers. It's not just me getting offended. It's not just anyone getting offended. That is a serious state in which somebody could be quite vulnerable. When people use the terminology too loosely, it cheapens it. The terminology loses its precision, and that's a problem because it adds fuel to the fire of this argument that mental illness isn't real. Look at how many people are using these terms. They can't all be mentally ill. We need to use language precisely and respect that it's there for a reason. And this is not me policing language, this is me just explaining what the true purpose of language is and why we could be contributing to a harmful phenomenon when we use it too loosely. Now, to counteract the fallacy that in the old days fewer people were mentally ill, this is a common mistake that people make. They say, in my day we didn't see this as often. I haven't been around long enough to really analyse this issue statistically. What we can say, and again, let's not deny it, we know it happened. There were periods in history up until relatively recently that people with mental illnesses were stigmatised. They were institutionalised sometimes and treated as if they couldn't make their own decisions. That was an oppressive regime. If they experienced real problems, they might have been told to get over it. They may have been labelled as weak. They may not have been believed when they were told that they were having these experiences. The same was happening to people who had experienced abuse, domestic abuse and rape, for example, as well. People in these vulnerable categories were being told their experiences weren't valid and that it didn't happen. Quite possibly the reason why we wanted to deny the existence of mental illness was that a lot of social factors, factors which we could have potentially chosen to change over time, were contributing to it, and by admitting that people had mental illness as a result of these factors, that society was contributing to it. Now, there are nuances to it that need to be examined, but social factors do impact mental illness and they can be largely responsible. So it's hard not to come to the conclusion that one of the reasons we wanted to deny the existence of mental illness was that we didn't want to, as a collective, take responsibility for allowing it to perpetuate. That's one possible explanation, but it's hard to argue with any precision that in the old days there were fewer people mentally ill, because in those days fewer people reported it, fewer people were willing to admit it because they knew that there was consequences for them socially. So in reality, no one can make that argument with precision. It's just not possible statistically. So the final word from me is that if you believe that people with mental illness should just get over it and that it's not real, ask yourself this, and I've asked this before. I use this argument because it is the ultimate in being able to show people exactly how important it is for us to take this seriously. If you remove a person's brain, do you think they'll be able to think or feel or do anything or even breathe? If we think mental illness isn't real, then we could be saying that the brain isn't important. We might as well be saying the brain isn't important, because by acknowledging that the brain and mental functioning is essential for us to live and to function, we also have to admit that it can be subject to dysfunction and that those dysfunctions are not the person's fault. I know for a fact how much mental illness hurts people because I experience it myself, and I've met numerous people in my career and in my personal life who have experienced it, and I've seen what happens when people deny it or minimize it. Let's not go down that path. Okay, we can choose to acknowledge the facts. We can choose to acknowledge that people need help. If we want to continue denying it, we're putting ourselves on the wrong side of history. So let's be compassionate to each other and let's work together to find a solution, because in the end, we don't know how many people who perhaps deny the existence of mental illness might be mentally ill themselves and might be perhaps unconsciously resentful that they didn't get the help they needed. And if you're one of those people, please believe me when I tell you that help is available. And I'm not going to say that it's an easy journey. I know how difficult it is, and unfortunately there are no guarantees of success in life, but change is possible. You just have to choose to take that first step. So thank you for joining me for this episode. As per usual, never take what you see on the internet as advice. If something is bothering you, if you have concerns about your life or somebody else's welfare, please seek professional assistance. And I would love to hear from my audience. If anybody wants to collaborate with me, or if anybody wants to ask a question or make a suggestion about topics that could be discussed on the program, please contact me. I'm keen to have a discussion with you all. And until next time, take care.